Welcome, colleagues, fellow councillors and officers. Welcome to this Grants Inquiry Panel, 27th of January. If I could first take any apologies for absence. Any been given, any received? No, thank you. For the benefit of those who are joining the meeting online, we're going to go around the room and say who we are and introduce ourselves. So I'll go first. Convener and St Thomas Councillor, Joe Hale.
Good afternoon, Bridge. Matt Hart from the Council Scrutiny team.
Good afternoon, Councillor Paxton Hood-Williams.
Aaron Jeffrey, yes, Councillor of Uplands Ward.
Mark Tribe, Councillor for Llangabalac and Valintra.
Councillor Kevin Griffiths, Pontelles Community Councillor.
Thanks very much. Item 2, disclosures of any personal and prejudicial interest. None. Prohibition of whip votes and declaration of party whips. And then we move on to item 4, public question time. None. Item 5, as it is, the grant strategic overview, and I think we've got Ben Smith to give that strategic overview and Jeff Dong. So I don't know who wants to go first.
Thank you, Chair. I will go first, and first of all acknowledge that although the report is nominally in my name, my thanks to Jeff Dong and his team for pulling it together. The capital team and the grants team sits under Jeff for overall financial control purposes and compliance with accounting instructions and financial procedure rules, which are some of the technicals set out in the report in terms of how we control it centrally in the Directorate. Before I forget, the revenue appendix was in the pack. The perils of a spreadsheet with 2 tabs, the capital appendix, I think, was not reproduced in the published papers, but is in the meeting invite update. So you have got the capital detail because it's referenced in the report as well as the revenue. In terms of the overall position, I'm going to be relatively brief because this is your setup meeting to think about what you want to think about and look at. It will come as no surprise to you that both revenue and capital specific grants are large in capital terms. Our specific grants exceed in any other item of funding the capital programme, even at the annual amount we allocate to unsupported borrowing and things like that. So capital grants are very, very significant in terms of financing our capital programme. By their very nature, though, they tend to be very scheme specific, and that may be an area of interest to you in terms of what they are, because there's obviously quite a lot of local discretional choice when it comes to what schemes within an overarching programme are allocated to. In terms of revenue, there's always an interesting tension and dynamic because I've had discussions in other panels and scrutiny inquiries before. The very nature of local government is that the budget is set net of specific grants. In accounting terms, we make no distinction between income, fees and charges as specific grants, and so the budget is set net to get to a position that is funded by revenue support grant, NNDR, and ultimately the amount that comes to council tax. And you'll see in the report a flavour of how big the revenue support grant and NNDR is, but a council that sets a budget nominally of 600 million net actually sets a budget of over £1 billion, of which a couple of £100 million comes from fees, charges and income, and a couple of £100 million from revenue, and that is in the public agenda pack and on the accompanying spreadsheet in terms of the detail of everything in our live risk register, in our grants register, for 24-25. The other couple of things I'd ask that you bear in mind when you start to form a view as to which ones you might want to think about. Not all revenue grants are equal. Many of them turn up every year almost automatically. They're as likely to turn up as revenue support grant and NNDR, local authority education grant, a number of the targeted interventions. You know, every year winters come and then winter pressures comes, and invariably there's a Welsh Government announced winter pressures fund for social care. So a number of them are sort of routine and rote. Whereas a number of them are absolutely applied for, bid for, and there's quite a lot of local discretion as to whether you choose to apply for them and what you do with them in terms of spend. Central Finance's function is to coordinate and control the overall, both balancing the capital programme and the revenue programme. Yes, it's accounted for in the ledger, but we don't go into much more detail than that. The reality is project managers and programme managers are appointed by the directorates for the spend, and they are tasked with producing the reports, data returns, sending them back through my grants team for control purposes for my paw print normally to be put on it, often with Jeff's on a number of them where it requires two, to maintain control. But a lot of your inquiry, I think, in due course will be around some of the areas of interest and the officers in those directorates who have got the programme managers that are making decisions what to bid for, what to apply for, how to capture and evidence it. And then the other thing I'd say is there's a relative degree of consistency these days with Welsh Government grant offers. The very vast majority come from their central grants warehousing team, I describe it as. And so you tend to get boilerplate conditions on all the terms and conditions. The offers look very familiar. It tends to be Schedule 1 that says what's it for, and there may be some nuances about flexibility and who's got how many paw prints have got to go on it for signing it. There are occasionally weird and wonderful ones that come via the WLGA as a sponsoring body for Welsh Government, and they tend to be the grant recipient, but then they invoice back to and fro with councils to get sums to us, but they tend to be relatively small. Some of the third parties and other bodies don't do it on electronic paper. I do mean electronic paper, literally. It's normally a 30-page grant offer that comes through on a PDF signed, and these days it's all done electronically and sent back, but the underlying substance is a 30-page paper document. Some of them do it all through A sign off and things like that, and it's done by components and tracks through, and it's done 100% digitally. That can be a little bit interesting because permission rights can make it difficult because it normally comes to me in the first instance, and it requires lots of people to be involved, and it tends to be a 3 or 4 step stage before enough fields are filled in for me to hit the button. And then you get some of the weirder ones, the UK government direct grant offers, so Levelling Up Fund, Shared Prosperity Fund. Levelling Up is done on an app these days, and it's an extension of the same app that does a lot of the PWLB data reporting for borrowing. The UK Shared Prosperity Fund one is done on a completely different app. Often app development results in time delays in terms of rollout. My experience of both of the apps is they do work now, but they were prolonged in terms of update. But you get a mixed economy of some of these, and not every authority is the same. For example, we are the regional lead for UK Shared Prosperity Funds, so I've got more involvement than my fellow treasurers in the region. But anyone who's got a Levelling Up offer is doing an online submission. And again, individual officers are submitting stuff in terms of what the project outputs are for when you get into thinking about the VFM. But today's was very much to give you a flavour of the overall scale relative to the council's activities, the relative degree of stability in a number of the grant offers, that some of them are boring enough to just turn up all the time, but very useful because they tend to be the large ones. The ones that may be of more interest are ones where there is much local choice over how and what you do with them. I think I'll pause there, Chair, because it's probably enough of my monotone voice, and see whether that gives enough of a flavour on the technicals, and whether either Jeff or the leader, I think, has now managed to connect and had some technical issues, wants to add anything further. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ben. Does Jeff or the leader want to add anything or come in?
Yeah, Chair, if I could just add a couple of quick points, if I may. Yeah, apologies, Chair, I got a connection issue at the moment, but if I drop out, I will try and rejoin. Just one thing to add, in terms of the principles around grants, what the administration has adopted for a number of years is that we are unable, often given the scale of the grants, to be able to step in if grants are reduced or if they end. And that has been an operating principle for some time. As Ben Smith said, if you look at the scale of the grants, the authority doesn't have, and no authority would have, the resources to step in to fully compensate for a national government change. So that is just a known principle that we operate on. But obviously, as Mr. Smith did say, we do make local choices around a number of the grants. And again, Chair, happy to come back to future sessions when you've absorbed the information and decided which areas you want to look most at, to answer any questions you may have around the political choices that are made where we have them in some of those local grants.
Yeah, thanks very much, Leader. So what you're saying is some of the grants could be used as a safety net?
No, what I'm saying is the grant the grants that are provided, often national government, grant awarding bodies, Welsh government may change the level of those grants or decide to eliminate those grants and remove them entirely. The operating principle for us is that we don't automatically have the step-in opportunity or the resources to be able to do that, where grants may end to come to the council.
That's a bit clearer. Thanks very much. Jeff?
Thanks, Chairman. Nothing material to add to the report, Chairman, really. Although Ben did reference the capital grants there in his introduction, and quite often at this time of year, as is their wont, Welsh Government or whoever the grant awarding body is has surplus funds at this time of year, and quite often we get offered grants at this time of year with a condition that is spent before the end of the financial year. So quite often, we're in that difficult position, caught between the devil and the deep blue sea of being given the chance of having grant money, but you have to spend it all in the next 6 to 8 weeks or so to be compliant with grant conditions. So there's always those challenges in respect of grant conditions and complying with them. But as Ben indicated, there's quite a robust framework around which officers work and discharge their grant responsibilities within the council. That it's quite a well-established process that officers follow.
Thanks very much. Councillor Black.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a couple of questions on Appendix 3, if I could. The last two columns in that appendix, NGA1 and NGA2, I'm not clear what those actually stand for.
So those, Chair, are acronyms for notification of grant awards set out in Appendices 1 and 2 around what the control procedures are for us. So notification to the Chief Financial Officer of an intention to apply for a grant, and then the sort of sign off for accepting grants and getting authorization from relevant spending departments, copying in cabinet members. It's a way of making sure we've got prior approvals. As Jeff indicated, sometimes we have to go retro, sometimes we have to have what I call year-end flipperoos. As long as there's flexibility in terms of substitution and rolling over, we will use them to the maximum, because ultimately almost all of the grants require only my or Jeff's signature on. A couple of them require the chief exec's, but so that just so it's not just us putting our paw print on them, because the reality is that the conscious decision to apply for a grant, take a grant, then utilise the grant rests with others. So those are what those NGAs are referring to, Peter, Councillor Black, sorry.
So in that context, what does O/S stand for? Outstanding. Outstanding, right? Of course it does.
and some of them will be simply on the basis officers are sometimes picking up on Jeff's point. We very often do get stuff at 2 minutes notice, and then we have to sometimes retrofit. But we still want the documentation done in the same way that if it's a big one, we then have to retrofit and go to cabinet seeking approval. But I do operate on the principle, if there is some free money coming, albeit with strings attached and 30 pages of terms and conditions, if it is the right thing to do, as long as we've got an email sign off that cabinet members are cited where appropriate, relevant officers are cited, the paperwork will come in due course. Is the intent. And obviously some of the routine ones, we don't force people to fill in an NGA process for all the ones that are absolutely routine that come every year, because it would just waste everyone's time. Do you want to apply for £100 million share of local authority education grant when you're going to get it every year? The ones that are ministerial priority. So it gives you a flavour of some of the bits at the margin. It goes back to what I said, that some grants are different to others in terms of expected to turn up or not versus consciously making a decision to go for them, would be the way I describe that, Councillor Black.
Okay, so if I was to ask which of these grants were ones which recurred every year and which were one-offs, would that be those which have NA next to them, or is that too simplistic?
I'll defer to Jeff. I suspect that's okay for NA, but I'll seek Jeff's guidance as the compiler of the master list. I think if for NA not applicable, that would be the case. But Jeff, you able to answer?
I think it's safe to say, Councillor Black, that assumption would be correct in that in the absence of an NGA1, that means it wasn't applicable when compiling the grants register. Therefore, to Ben's point, they're recurring, business as usual grants and not discretionary in that respect.
So the Y would indicate they're one-offs, which may not be repeated. NA would indicate that they are regular year-on-year grants, which you would normally rely on.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Any other questions, observations, comments? Paxton? Yes.
Good afternoon. Ben will know full well that I've nagged for a couple of years to have a gross budget as well as a net budget. I've not been successful yet, but this is a move in that direction, I guess. So I'll keep my fingers crossed for the next 10 years getting one. You never know. Anyway, I think basically one of the reasons that I was interested in this is that I really wanted to know just how exposed that we were to grant income, because obviously by definition, I guess, grant income can be withdrawn at any point in time. So there's no guarantee that you're going to get it year in, year out. And when we look at this, I see a figure of 173,000 at the bottom there. I had a figure in my mind which is a bit more than that, somewhere about 250,000, but there we go. But having said that, over 80% of that comes from Welsh Government. And when you look at the RSG as well, we're totally dependent effectively almost on on grant funding from Welsh Government. There's a certain amount of other grant coming in, about 150, 170,000, I think, in terms of revenue. But the bulk of the payment is coming from Welsh Government. So it worries me in that sense, just how exposed we are and to what extent we can plan that successfully for the future, for your three-year plans or your 5-year plans, in terms of when you're reliant on grants to that extent, knowing that you're going to get them from Welsh Government. So I don't know if there's an answer to that.
I'm happy to come in, Chair. I would have been disappointed if Councillor Paxton Hood-Williams hadn't raised it. It's a perennial one. I explain every time that, look, the lateness of specific grant offers, they often come after we've set the net budget, which may blow people's minds. But the reality is we make no distinction on specific grants, whether it's income, fees and charges, whatever. When you're making the decision, and yes, it is 175 million, Councillor Black, yeah, not hundreds of thousands, 175 million. It rightly, which answers one of Councillor Paxton Hood-Williams' questions about how big is it. It is very, very big. Yes, we are exposed in one sense, but he also has answered the question himself in the sense that 80-90% of all specific grants and 100% of RSG comes from Welsh Government. So we're exposed if they decided to cut specific grant. We would be exposed if they decided to cut or didn't increase revenue support grant. I know it's unlikely you'd expect it to be materially cut. There have been a couple of years where I think RSG went down in my lifetime being in Wales. But normally it goes up, but sometimes it's quite flat. Sometimes it's due to technical transfers. And often the reason that one goes up and one goes down is because specific grants are transferred into revenue support grant. It's the same cups run by the same people, just moved around in a different way. So I think the point you make is right, that we are exposed significantly to Welsh Government for both specific grants and for core grants. Council tax, whatever the figure ends up being, however popular or unpopular it is, whatever decisions are made on the rates, ultimately funds a relatively small proportion of everything we do. So we are entirely dependent. And the final point I would make is, yeah, I struggle to set with certainty specific grants for the year ahead, because some of them I won't get until in year. Jeff has quite rightly pointed out several of them we get revisions in year, and some of them we get lastminute.com. End of March, can you flip some money because there's a bit of spare money? So there's always these bits, and that's just for the short-term stuff. And the biggie for me is whether it's specific grant or revenue support grant, the big thing that local government in Wales, which would scream to Welsh Government, and Welsh Government would say the same, as would every local authority in England, is, could we have more than 1 year hand-to-mouth existence, last-minute December settlements? I'm old enough to remember settlements coming in September and having 6 months to work on a budget. And it has been quite a while since the last significant spending review. I do look forward to spending reviews continuing, having restarted or plan to be restarted, and give us at least some certainty for 3 years hence, or even longer if at all possible, because our auditors say you haven't got 20-year guaranteed plans. Well, 99% of our income isn't guaranteed for beyond the next 6 months. And I think those points are important. I wouldn't get too het up about being exposed on specific grant versus core grant, other than the point which is it's much easier for and more likely that some specific grants would end. They are often ministerial priorities designed for a specific purpose, and if they're deemed to work, they will continue. If they're deemed not to have worked, they may well cease, or they may be reprioritised into something else. There is perhaps slightly more risk on some of those ending completely, but the point is very well made that the very vast majority of all of our activity in local government for us in Wales is dependent on the amount of money Welsh Government gets. In the same way, Welsh Government is heavily dependent on what the UK Government gives it. And in England, it is very much the same. The mechanics are slightly different because of the way that schools are being stripped out and funded through dedicated schools grant. And you will often find in the media, anything you read is England-centric. And the first thing you've always got to do is discard half of it. Because if you read anything about England, it's always 88% of all upper tier authority spending is on social care, because they always exclude schools because they've been sort of taken off and put on a side track, whereas it's still within the overall budget decision and quantum for councils to decide how to allocate revenue support grant. So it's a long answer, but I think a reasonable attempt at answering it and picking up on some very pertinent points that needed to be raised and I thought were worth answering, even though I'm not guaranteeing anytime soon that you'll have a magic fully at the March budget setting every specific grant known for the year ahead, because many of them we won't even know.
Thanks very much, Ben. And I got Mike White, Councillor White.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just one question, Ben, in relation to the levelling up fund or shared perception. Have you been given indication? Given any indications 151 also that the new UK government are going to continue with this scheme, or are you anticipating they might come up with another sort of formula?
Oops, I've remuted myself as I tried to speak. Bit of a mixed economy. Currently, UK government has dropped some hints about there will be some changes. We are seeing some changes proposed to the quantum of UK Shared Prosperity Fund. And I think there is quite a lot of activity, and in terms of some pausing of those that are in the third wave of Levelling Up Fund UK having to wait, and certainly some rethinking about what the priorities are. So I know with certainty that there is a continuation in some form of Shared Prosperity Fund, albeit with changes to quantums and priorities as a result of interaction between UK and Welsh Government. Levelling Up, those of us that were in the first waves and got something, we've got. I think there are some nervous authorities waiting to see what UK government decides to do, because there has been a bit of a pause and a proposal to think what it might look like going forward in terms of driving the growth agenda. That's probably all I could say, Councillor White, at this stage. So I don't have absolute guarantees that both are going to continue ad infinitum for forever. That's always one of the risks and rubs of specific grants, which the point colleagues have already made. But that's probably what I've got at the moment as a Section 151 for those of you, Councillor White. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thanks very much. Any more questions, observations, comments? No? Can we let them go? Oh, yeah, sorry. You're sticking around, I've been told.
Clearly not being good behaviour enough yet.
No. And what are we doing? Is this the question? Should we introduce? Yeah, if you would like to.
Sorry, Chair. Just to again a bit of background for yourselves. So clearly, this is the first meeting. It's effectively an introductory meeting. So it really made sense as a starting point to get the information that you've just had from Ben, from Jeff, obviously from the leader, to give you a bit of a foundation in relation to how grants fit into the overall picture of the council's financial resources, and of course anything that we wanted to bring to your attention before you embark on an inquiry. So the objective for today is to leave today with a clear focus as to what this inquiry, and what I mean by that is that you're going to have a series of evidence gathering sessions over a number of months. So this is not a one meeting topic. So hopefully, if you've got a sound understanding now of that foundation and the information that's been provided to you, the panel then is in a position to agree the focus. So if it's about now moving on to item 6, and you've got in your pack, you can see that actually a draft terms of reference was put together, but of course can be tweaked based on what you've heard and based on your exchange of views and thoughts. But just to sort of summarize and highlight from that, but what that draft says is that the inquiry is going to have a strategic focus on how well the council manages the grants that it receives, and their significance to departmental and overall budgets. So essentially, the inquiry is going to be looking at what the council does well, and perhaps what can be improved in this area. So it's really important to have a key question. So the key question that is put before you, but for you to agree, is how can the council ensure that grants that it receives are working to provide the best outcomes for the people of Swansea? And the document has then a number of sub-questions detailing the sort of things, the sort of questions that will lend themselves to when you've got different people in front of you, whether they're departmental representatives or whether they're people from other organisations or external partners and so on. When you're going to be speaking to various stakeholders, and some of that is set out in a draft project plan for yourselves. And it also includes a public perspective on this. So we'll be issuing a call for evidence that's going to invite anyone outside of the council to submit views. Once that's agreed, once you hopefully today can agree that key question and that focus for your inquiry, we can then, from the scrutiny team point of view, assist yourselves in terms of organising a number of evidence gathering sessions, as I said, over a number of months, and speak to relevant persons, gain information from a range of perspectives, get the information that you want, and hear people's experiences as you explore the lines of inquiry. As I said, the outline project plan is shown. And looking at then what that leads to is that following that evidence gathering, the panel then will be invited to reflect and consider findings and work on a final report with then conclusions and recommendations that you as a panel will formally present to Cabinet for decision. So, Chair, the question is, you see a draft in front of you. Is the panel happy with that for us to take that forward and then obviously work with yourselves to plan the evidence gathering? Or is there anything that needs to be tweaked? Is there something that's perhaps not mentioned there that members feel it would be good to hear from X or Y, or particularly to ask a particular question? But even when you get into the evidence gathering and it becomes apparent that you need to, there's a gap in that evidence gathering that you need to hear from a certain person or persons, then of course we can obviously adapt as well as we go along. But the main point is that you've got a clear focus for the inquiry today, and that's agreed today. Thanks.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks very much. So, Councillor Black, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I have to say that the number of grants here are far more than I expected. I wasn't expecting this many, but one aspect I'm interested in looking at as part of this inquiry is the actual cost of administering these grants. I mean, obviously, whenever you get a grant, I assume you have to do a return to the person giving you the grant, telling you how you spent it. There's paperwork involved. So I'm interested in what sort of percentage cost and how difficult these are to administer in terms of the accounts. I mean, obviously, we've been doing a lot of this for many years, but it'd still be interested to see what the impact on the council administration of having to administer these grants, such a huge number of them.
Thanks very much. I think for me, it's also around the measure of success of any particular grant gets or makes. So you see a lot of single grants or schemes. Just one example, I suppose, is food poverty. And I'm not arguing against having grants for food poverty, but are they reaching the target area? So what's the process? Because there's several similar grants like that here. And I'm just wondering, what's the process? What's the process of identifying the need? And then once you've identified the need, how successful is that grant? So does it reach those that should be targeted, or the targeted intervention approach? That's specific grants, but a specific grant, but I think there's several that feed into that sort of model. Ben?
Chair, if I can come in, it's for the panel to decide, but my view, having read them, and to some extent they may be valid or not, is the question 2 around how they fit in overall and clear links to others is an interesting one, especially when you refer to, say, food poverty. If grant terms and conditions are normally, well, they are set by the grant provider. It's how wide a lens do you take on it? Because to some extent you can only take the terms and conditions as offered. It's whether you're looking to only see what you've done locally. It may be appropriate to be looking to use this as a way of feeding back gently to our grant providers that they may need to loosen some of the constraints on terms and conditions, which could otherwise result in less than optimal outcomes if we were allowed freely to do it locally. It's one of the main reasons why councils argue that they prefer not specific grants but block grants to be able to do local choices and local decisions. So just a suggestion on that one. I'm not suggesting any of the questions aren't right. And in similar vein, number 7. How do we look at it through an equality lens? Well, to some extent, I would hope that the grant provider and giver has thought about a rather large number of those equality lens items. And if they've put constraints on what it can or cannot be used for, there may again be limitations as to how you can influence it. To some extent, in the short term, you're a grant receiver and you take it on the terms that are given, but it's how practical or how aspiring your plan is as a panel to look to feed back to grant providers as to do they design them in such a way with terms and conditions that facilitate us being as equal as we would like to be. Just some observations. I'm not, as I say, saying don't ask those questions. I'm just thinking you've got to think about how much influence, with the greatest of respect, you have nationally on some of these, where often terms are dictated to us, but there are normally fora for feeding back to grant givers things that haven't worked. And I think that's probably the example you were alluding to, Chair, wasn't it? That to some extent on some of these things, was it the right thing to do? Well, sometimes it might have been the only thing to do because it's the only way we could comply with the terms and conditions. So just a couple of thoughts on those, which I hope is of assistance, but I'm not trying to guide the panel in any way, shape or form, of course.
No, thanks, Ben. But I'm just interested in how we measure success. That's all.
The measure success one is an interesting one because to some extent, often a number of these grants come with prescribed reportable outputs. That would be a way that you're at least testing some of them. Often the grant terms and conditions say this grant is continued and expected, and for this we expect 1,000 of these, 2,000 of these, 3,000 of these. So a number of them that should be measurable in a number of instances if the report required of the program project manager when reporting back is specifying, well, what did it give us for that? So I'm less worried about that one. I think that one is okay, Chair.
Yeah, I'd be more around looking at if anything substantially is changing. I remember I would have thought you've been around a while, Ben, so you remember Communities First, and it really didn't. The idea of that was to try to get as many people out of NEETs, wasn't it, as possible, and into full-time jobs. And I think that might have failed quite significantly. I think that's why it was pulled in the end, because there just wasn't the figures. There was figures, and the figures said that 100 people done this and 100 people done that. But as for them moving on into full-time work, I don't think it achieved what it set out to do. That's not a criticism. That's the fact. That's what happened.
I don't disagree with you, Chair. I think I was being coy on the basis I'm merely an officer and it's not for me to observe on whether intended policy outcomes from a national level worked. But yes, I have been around long enough to have been involved in those sorts of things. Yeah. And I entirely recognise the points you are making on that. Other grants are available where you could, on a wider perspective question, did it really achieve what was intended, notwithstanding whatever outputs were claimed to be out. So I was being deliberately coy, which is most unlike me to be shy and bashful, isn't it? But I think those are points well made, and on some of them it is legitimate to take a step back and evaluate, well, did it get anywhere near achieving what was really the intent? So I acknowledge that point, Chair.
Thanks very much, Ben. Anybody else want to go? Paxton?
Thank you, Chairman. In terms of the grants that we get from Welsh Government, Ben, how much notice do we, or how far into the year do we get them? Do we get them before you set your budgets? Do you get them halfway through the financial year of the budget or whatever? Because what I'm getting at, I think, the earlier you know about a grant that's coming, the better that you can plan its use. And if they're coming in late in the year, then that causes you, I would suspect, problems in terms of making sure that we get a maximum value for money out of them.
I will be very brief, but it is multivaried. We get some notified through indicatively through January, February, March. Most of our grant allocations, headlines for Wales are in the grant settlement, the block grant settlement, and it enables us to work out that if they're flat, it is reasonable for us to flat nationally. It's reasonable for us to assume they're flat, but we get very few in time to have absolute certainty for budget setting. So if it's flat at the national level, we make the assumption it's flat at a local level, and we build the specific grant and income budgets on the basis that there's no change. Many flow through soon after March. We get a number in the 3 weeks after March, between setting the budget and the start of the new financial year. It would be unheard of for us not to have had at least 2 local authority education grant major uplifts in year, often September, often February. You will have heard me say about some of the weirder and wackier ones around pension grant funding, temporary, until it's been put in the base, waiting 10 months for the grant, but we've been paying out all year. The record, I think, is we did have a grant for a specific scheme where the grant offer was received on the 30th of March for disbursement by the 31st of March, which was very challenging given it wasn't just signing the bit of paper, it had to be defrayed, technically spent, cleared funds, and involved property, legals, not just our side and others. So my record is turning it all around in one day, with an exempt report with delegated authority from Cabinet to allow me to put my paw print on it and do the deal with the Chief Legal Officer. So it's the reason that it's difficult to set the budget with absolute certainty on the specific grants, and a number of them are uplifted, often well-meaning. Welsh Government has found some more money, or a new initiative is not. The winter fuel, the winter pressures comes. I work on the base. I can't budget for what I don't officially know, but I'd be devastated as a treasurer, so would 21 others, if it didn't get to Crimbo and then suddenly someone say there's a bit of a backlog in the NHS. I'm smiling, Chair, thinking of yourself. There's a bit of a backlog in the NHS, and it would be jolly helpful if there's some money for social care. Every year there's a winter crisis allowance, and some money turns up. I'd be really disappointed if no money turned up on some of them, as sure as eggs is eggs. And Jeff and I also refer to some where it ends up having to be substitution. 6 weeks before year end, can you spend this capital money? Fortunately, Welsh Government is sensible enough to often have flexibility arrangements that allows you to substitute. As long as you can find something you've already spent money on which wasn't grant funded, badge that as a grant funded, and promise on best dibs as a Section 151 officer that you will guarantee additionality in the following year, that any money you saved in year one, you put back in year two. And we often see these around schools, building maintenance and such like. So it's far from advance notice on a number of them. And the sheer number that go, normally it's up, but the sheer number of variations, I think we get quite a few, and there've been more and more in recent years in terms of adjustments and variations in year. Welcomed when the money's going up. But it does mean, literally we could take a snapshot at almost any point in time and the figure may have changed. Hopefully that gives you a flavour of how wild and wacky it can be. And I can assure you, it is a bit Keystone Cops when you've got a day to get around and shift several million quid when it involves multiple other parties. And you always you don't want to be the mixing my metaphors, but you don't want to be the one left with the pass the parcel or the baby in the bathwater sort of type thing, because these are procedural, but there are strict cut-offs, and you don't want to you don't comply through accident when you're really up against the wire. They're rare that they're as late as a 24-hour turnaround, but we have done them. Jeff will know I've dealt with them, often for good reason. But it does heighten one's anxiety when it's that close to the year end, because you can't then undo that the calendar's clicked around you into the new year when it comes to being subject to audit opinion on have you appropriately accounted for them in your accounts.
I guess you're saying, Ben, the sooner you get to know about the grant, the better. I'm sure the leaders listening to this and will take it back to the WLGA as well. So it might be interesting to see what happens if there's any response in that respect. But anyway, thank you for the answers.
Thanks very much. Leader wants to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, just on that point, look, just to reiterate, in terms of the WLGA position, as Mr. Smith alluded to earlier, we lobby on the basis constantly that we would like most grants rolled into RSG wherever possible, because that does give us a bit of a higher degree of certainty. And we always ask for not only grants to be announced at the same time as the RSG, but also to make sure that the terms and conditions of those grants are published at the same time as the level of the grant, because that can often be a further complicating delay, is that you know there's money coming, but you don't know how you're allowed to spend it and what the rules are. So again, it is a complex picture, but just to reassure you, that is something that we continually lobby via the WLGA to Welsh Government. Just stepping back, Chair, to the other points you made around the effectiveness of grants. And again, it may be something that the committee want to look at. I think the challenge always with that is that often a grant will be only a part of what funds an initiative or a program. And when you unpick things like the poverty and social services funding elements, you will see that they are interwoven many streams of different parts of funding. So trying to establish whether a specific part of a specific grant has helped achieve an objective can be challenging. But again, I think that might be something that the committee might want to look at, because often grants are combined with lots of other streams of funding to try and deliver against one aim or one objective. So it is difficult always to try and identify whether a specific grant has met all of its objectives.
Thanks very much. Any questions? No? Are we done for yeah?
Just to say, Chair, so obviously taking on board all the comments that are made and observations in terms of, tweaking how you might approach evidence gathering sessions. I think, with that, I think the question for the panel is, are you happy for those terms of reference that are in front of you to be agreed?
We're happy for the terms of reference, but I think we might want to tweak one or two areas. Is that okay? Or not? You happy with the terms of reference?
If they need, we can then generally suggest we work in bridge.
Yes.
And come back to us.
Yeah.
We can circulate.
Yeah.
Recirculate.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Sorry, Chair. Did Paxton not use his microphone? I didn't hear what he said.
Sorry, I should have put the microphone on. What I was saying, Peter, basically, if the chairman is happy that he thinks that they need tweaks there, that effectively works with Bridge, produce a paper for us, sends it to us, and we can then comment on that and see where we go from there.
Can I just add in, Chair, that the administration costs as one thing to look at?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks.
Definitely. Thanks very much. Oh, are you happy to close the meeting? Yes. Thanks for everybody's attendance. Thank you.
From my point of view, if I may, just a quick word to Ben for.
Yes, I'm not left. I'm happy to hear it, Councillor Paxton Williams.
Ta-ra.
Bye all.